Hi, girls. Welcome back. Happy Easter. Hope everybody's doing well. So, I'm going to get started with a review of World War II, the causes, and that will introduce and kind of just refresh you. And then we'll get right into the theaters of World War II and the different things that are happening. Okay, so let's look. When we look at World War II, we have to kind of go back and begin with World War One. So people across the world had said that the Great War, as it was called at the time, was the war to end all wars. At its conclusion, the punishing Treaty of Versailles was supposed to have rendered Germany completely powerless. So we kind of talked about that, and I'll go over that in a minute. We know the League of Nations was formed to prevent further wars of aggression. There's numerous treaties and agreements signed between different nations in the 1920s. In the United States, now this is not U.S. history, but there are big players. So there's in the Senate, there's something called the NYE committee, and that is basically they had convinced the United States government that World War One had been more about money than national security, leading to policies that establish America's neutrality in conflicts around the world. Okay. So they want to kind of stay out of any further wars. That's how the US is going to kind of stay out, and we'll talk about what draws them in. So, how did another world war start? And this one is going to be more destructive than the first. Okay. So, just in a sense, and like I said, this is the US. How does it start? What are some of the things that are going on? So we talked about all of these things. We talked about German reparations. We talked about redrawn borders. Okay. We talked about this resentment of the Treaty of Versailles, how the Germans are paying money, how Germany lost territory. So you can see the size of Germany post World War One as opposed to before World War One. Okay, so the size has changed. We also looked at economic depression. We know in the United States we're going to have the Great Depression, and this is going to have a domino effect on the rest of the nations of the world, especially Germany, because the Germans are highly dependent on the American economy. They're taking loans out to repay these reparations. Okay. We also have this idea of Hitler's leadership. He's going to challenge the Treaty of Versailles. He's going to remilitarize the German military. He's going to practice military aggression, which we'll look at in the next slide. He's also going to practice nationalism in the extreme sense. So when we look at nationalism, you see up there the definition. And in the case of this time period, we're going to be talking about a couple different leaders: Hitler, Mussolini, Japan's leader Tojo, and Stalin is included in this, even though he's kind of a communist leader as well as an extreme nationalist. Okay, so again, we have Mussolini, we have Hitler, and Stalin, and then Tojo in Japan. Okay, we also have anti-Semitism, which we will talk about next week when we talk about the Holocaust. Then we have this idea of an alliance system and the policy of appeasement. And here you see Neville Chamberlain shaking hands with Hitler to avoid war. Okay, and so that's what's happening as far as the causes. And so these are some of the power players that we'll see during World War II. Okay, so let's get into this aggression. So President Wilson had said that the United States' involvement in World War I would make the world safer for democracy. Yet within 2 decades, many parts of Europe and Asia had turned away from democracy and embraced this one man, one party system. And several leaders were not content to stay within their borders. So going back to those fascist leaders. So Benito Mussolini formed the Fascist Party in 1919, and by 1926 he had complete control over Italy. Then he moved to reestablish the old Roman Empire by invading Ethiopia in 1935. Yet the League of Nations looked on without a military force. They couldn't do much more than embargo or cut off exports and imports to Italy. Okay, Adolf Hitler was inspired by Mussolini after consolidating fascist power in 1933. Hitler tested the limits of the League's power. So nothing had happened when he withdrew from the League of Nations or when he announced that Germany was going to rearm or re up its military in 1935. So, when the League of Nations failed to stop Mussolini's expansion, Hitler turned his own attention outward. In 1936, he sent 32,000 troops with air support. So now we have the Air Force involved into an area known as the Rhineland. Okay, and we talked about the Rhineland. This is the area right here. Um, so he sends them into the Rhineland. And that was kind of forbidden. They weren't supposed to do this, which he remilitarizes this buffer zone that was forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. When the League of Nations, what do? Well, they officially disapprove, but they really don't do anything. Then Germany and Italy sign a military alliance in 1936, also in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. And again, the League does nothing. Germany and Italy both sent aid to the fascist leader of Spain, which will be Franco, which we don't really go over too in depth, during the nation's civil war. Through the League, though the League had forbidden foreign involvement, they're not really supposed to give any support. So in 1938, Hitler has this thing called Anschluss, Anschluss, the reunification of Germany and Austria. And this goes unopposed. Okay, so he's going to take back this part of Austria, which is where Hitler's actually from. Then in September of 1938, Great Britain and France, eager to avoid war, signed something called the Munich, Munich agreement, approving Germany's occupation of the Sudetenland, which is this area right here, which was a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia, because Hitler promised he would not take any more territory. So again, appeasement, appeasement, appeasement. Okay. So that's kind of what's going on in Europe. Then we have this Asian theater, what's happening in Asia. So the players here are Japan, China. So what's going on here? So this is not the only part that has aggression. So by 1931, China had this civil war. So you have the communists kind of rising up in China as well at this time. And Japan took advantage of this instability. In 1931, they fabricated or came up with an excuse to invade Manchuria and seize control of all its resources because Japan lacks natural resources. So the international community does little. They do not intervene when Japan invades Shanghai, which is the capital. There is a population there of a lot of expatriates, which we would say there's a lot of British living there, French living there, Americans living there. So the League protests, but Japan just basically leaves the League. Okay. So by 1937, China and Japan were in all-out war, beginning with the re-invasion of Shanghai, the capital. Quickly, Japanese forces moved in on the capital of the city of Nanking in 1937. Okay. And the Americans basically decide to evacuate their citizens. So they get this gunboat called the Panay, Panay, and 3 other oil tankers, and they're leaving. And as they're leaving, which they have a lot of civilians, they're attacked by the Japanese Navy. Now, the Japanese do not want to get involved in a war just yet. So Emperor Hirohito at the time claims that it was just a mistake. It was an accident. Okay, so the sinking of the Panay was just an accident. So they apologize. So Americans are kind of upset about this. They're horrified by the unspeakable atrocities that the Japanese are carrying out upon the Chinese capital. And this event is known as the Rape of Nanking. Okay, and so there's some really terrible things that are going on, massacres, killings, and this is often referred to as the Rape of Nanking. So the U.S. decides to pass economic sanctions, meaning they're not going to trade with them, and send aid to China. By 1939, Japan's war against China was floundering, and the nation, now under the influence of a military mastermind, Hideki Tojo, who I referred to before, is looking for a way to combat American intervention. So the Americans are kind of putting a wrench in the Japanese plan to take over China. Okay, so now let's get into the declarations of war. What is happening? Okay, So now let's see how this all fits together. On September 1st, 1939, a fast-moving, well-trained German army storms across the Polish border from north, south, east, west, and that's the term blitzkrieg, while the Soviets are moving in the helpless nation from the east. Finally, the European democracies had had enough. So the invasion of Poland prompts Britain and France to declare war on Germany. Within months, Hitler's army controlled most of the northern and western Europe. So Hitler has a lot of early successes as far as World War II. Within months, Hitler's army is controlling pretty much all of this area, and they're going to storm Paris. Okay, so that's what's going on as far as um, Europe. Suddenly, in Asia, General Tojo saw an answer to his problems. So you see, there is a lot of English, French, Dutch colonies in the Pacific. So if we look at this, this is kind of the map of the area we're talking about. If Japan can control some of them, Tojo would have the resources he needed to continue his conquest of China and prevent other foreign governments from supplying aid to China through their colonies. Okay, so a lot of these colonies are owned by the British, the French, the Americans. So Japan decides to formally make an alliance with Germany and Italy, and this is in September 1940, forming the core of what we call the Axis powers. Soon thereafter, Japan occupied French Indochina. Indochina is a nation we now know as Vietnam, so we're talking about this area over here. Okay. Still, the U.S. refuses to declare war in either Europe or Asia. They do not want to get involved. Instead, the government allowed certain types of arms sales to its European allies, and we'll talk about that. It's called Lend-Lease, and institute a complete oil embargo, meaning they're not going to sell any oil to the Japanese. In 1941, both Germany and Japan wanted to discourage American involvement in their conquest schemes and weakened America's ability to fight, just in case it did decide to declare war. So Hitler, submarines begin targeting U.S. ships, and we'll talk more about that are approaching England. And Tojo, now the Prime Minister of Japan, decides to attack several possessions in the Pacific, including the naval base at Pearl Harbor. So we're talking about Hawaii, right? Okay, so this is the coast of the U.S. This is Hawaii, and this is Japan. Now, the Japanese decide to attack Pearl Harbor, okay? And this brings the U.S. into war, all right? So we know there's many casualties in Pearl Harbor. And if you go to the PowerPoint, you can watch the quick video on Pearl Harbor. Okay, so now we have war. We basically have the world at war. Once again, the Allied powers are the UK, France, Soviet Union, and the United States, and the Axis is Nazi Germany, Japan, and Italy. And you can see here how many deaths. This is going to be a deadly war, lots of casualties, and we'll get into that in the next presentation.